All right, welcome back to another episode of The Hard Sell. I'm your host, Joel Stevenson. This week, we've got quite an interesting guest. Shawn Rhodes is recognized as a top expert in sales in the industry. He's been called the OG of sales systems. He is the chief sales sergeant of Bulletproof Selling, an international keynote speaker, author of 4 books, nationally syndicated columnist. And Shawn has dedicated his career to help salespeople make their processes bulletproof. So, Shawn, welcome to The Hard Sell.
My pleasure to be here, sir. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's quite an interesting concept, and you've got, I think, quite a maybe a slightly different history than a lot of the sales folks or sales leaders that I talk to on the show. And so maybe just give us the origin story of how you got to this place and sort of came up with this system and wrote a book and all that.
So my sales, origins didn't start on a sales floor or in a pit or, dialing for dollars or any of that stuff. It actually started on the battlefield, like actual battlefields. My role in the U.S. Marine Corps, they gave me a pretty interesting job as an enlisted guy. It was to embed with combat teams, follow them to the front lines. And in addition to fighting alongside them, so they gave me a rifle and everything else, regular combat load, I had to study how these men and women were able to succeed in these scenarios where they didn't really expect anybody to walk back out alive. But we had a way of doing it. And the Marine Corps, the Department of Defense wanted to know why and how, really. So I studied these teams over and over, and I realized that we would have to innovate on every single mission. Like, as well as we built our plans and as much time and money as we spent studying our high value targets and, mapping our routes and assessing threats, our mission plan still changed once we were on the battlefield. But these Marines had a way of adapting and innovating at a rate that put most private companies to shame. And it wasn't just something that happened occasionally. It was on every mission. What it meant was they didn't get better at dodging the threats that were thrown at them. What they looked at every single mission were ways to stop the threats from ever happening. So I liken this, during my keynote talks to say that, they didn't stop the rounds from being fired at them. They didn't dodge the rounds. They stopped them from ever being fired, right? And when I got into sales, when I started running my own business and working alongside sales teams as part of my consulting work, I realized that the challenges that most of the salespeople that I saw were running into were repeat challenges. I hear the same objections every single day. I get the same, no response on my emails every single week. Every time I'm in a buyer conversation, this usually comes up, this one thing that stalls the sale. And it takes salespeople dozens of times often enough to get over that one hurdle so that they figure out a way around it. They figure out how to turn around the objection. They figure out how to be bulletproof themselves. So the work that I do is the same thing I was doing for the Marine Corps, which is to study how these men and women were able to be bulletproof on the battlefield. Now I bring that into business. I work with sales teams and I address sales audiences to help them be bulletproof so that they can sell more, and to the mission that we had in the military so that they can serve more as well.
In the military context, was the idea they were trying to sort of create a scalable system? Was this to help? I'm trying to go back in time. If like this was a period when we were like enabling other foreign forces to help fight their own battles, or whether this is just like internal to the military, like was the idea that there were some very successful teams, and like what was it about these teams that were working, and how do we then spread that to additional frontline teams? And
exactly,
because the performance was somewhat it wasn't very even in some sense.
Well, there's always going to be high performers on any team. I mean, I go into any sales organization and those leaders can usually help me identify the top 10%. So the question becomes, well, if they weren't mutants, they don't have some natural ability to do this that the rest of us weren't born with, it means they had to learn it. What are the things they had to learn along the way that we can capture and scale out to the rest of your team so that they don't have to wait 10, 20, 30 years to learn those key things that allow them to be successful? So in the military, because we were operating across the world, we would learn something from a mission that we were running in Fallujah. And because we were fighting an enemy that communicated with each other, we would have forces in Afghanistan as well. Well, if we saw them use a new tactic in Fallujah, we needed to get that into the Korengal Valley so that our Marines there could immediately benefit from it, because it meant mission success for them. It meant more of them could come home. Now let's look at how this would operate on a sales team. If you're part of a sales team that's spread out across the country, either because you have different offices or because you're not all co-located, one person learned something in New York. Well, what about your teammate down there in LA? Are you going to let them learn the hard way? And most sales teams do, which is why, they have one performer in one geography and they say it must be because of that geography. And I say that's part of the equation, but really it's your performer. They figured something out. And if we scale that, if we figure out a way to capture it and make sure that your other team members know about it, should they run into that scenario, they'll be just as successful too.
Right. Yeah, we see this on the Yesware side. We've got a bunch of data from hundreds, thousands of sales teams that we found that sales teams that do a good job communicating these types of wins and systematizing those wins will outperform ones that don't by multiples. It's pretty
Sure.
remarkable, actually. And so I'm curious, when you're sort of rolling out this concept, let's say somebody buys in and says, okay, well, that makes sense. And, I trust you, that you've seen this in sort of high stakes scenarios, and, sales is important, but not that important. What are kind of the steps that somebody needs to take to try to go from, sort of a random system of individuals that figure it out to sort of an approach where you're getting better performance out of an entire team by sharing some of these systems and best practices?
So most salespeople, they want to start by recapturing their losses. This can absolutely be used to replicate wins, but I find most salespeople are more interested in saving deals that they otherwise would have lost. So let's start there, because that's where the lost revenue is coming from. It's to take a look at not how do we solve this problem once, but how do we solve it forever? That's where this whole concept of being bulletproof comes in. It's not that you're getting faster and more nimble at dodging that objection. It's looking at how do we stop that objection or that stall in our sales cycle from ever occurring again for any of us. And that's what we did on the battlefield. When you think about the ways that we used to fight, like in the Revolutionary War, we'd line up in a big long line and we would just hurl cannonballs and musket fire at each other until attrition basically decided who had won the day. Well, we figured out in the Revolutionary War, we didn't have the numbers. That wasn't going to work for us here in the United States. So what we had to do, we had to fight more like guerrillas. We had to use asymmetrical warfare. Salespeople can do this as well. And I never, I'm very military-esque in what I bring to the table. I'd never consider treating our prospects as the enemy, but I do consider them high-value targets, because those are the people that I can serve so that we all can accomplish our mission together. So to take a look at, where is this sale stalling? Where am I losing my sales? So, you can look at a couple different ways, because some people are interested in just a faster moving pipeline. Some folks say, we'd like to open up this market. We're having a lot of difficulty there. Or we get the sale to this point, and every single time it stalls right here because our prospects start shopping on price or whatever that reason is. So to look at that and ask, all right, well, if we wanted to maybe not eliminate that problem right away, but mitigate it, what are the ways that some members of our team are figuring out ways around and through that issue? And there's always a member of your team that's doing it. If you're in one of the rare teams that isn't, this is a very small percentage where somebody hasn't figured this out, you reach out to your network. You start listening to podcasts like The Hard Sell. You start listening to Bulletproof Selling. You start researching, all right, well, who in any other industry has figured out a way around this? And how can I adjust what I'm doing to make sure that I am operating differently when this problem crops up next time? You do that, and now you've not only mitigated the problem, you're beginning to eliminate it. Second step is then to ask, well, earlier in the sales cycle, how can I set the stage, set up the chessboard so that that problem is addressed much earlier on in our marketing or in our very first conversations, so that by the time we get to that point of conversion, that problem got addressed weeks ago. And if anybody was paying attention, they'd know to not bring it up now because we already talked about it.
Right. What do you ever sort of see or talk to folks where, sometimes you end up with sales cultures that end up being like a little bit more just like a lone wolf culture, where it's the salesperson might say, well, if I'm outperforming everybody else, that's good for me, because if everybody outperforms, then maybe quotas go up and I don't make as much. So it's like, it's actually better for me to be way out here and everybody else way behind me.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Have you seen that? Like, how do you how do you handle some of those situations?
So do you want me to coach the senior salesperson that wants more of that for themselves, or do you want me to coach the team leader that needs more of their folks on the same page? Because we can go either way.
Yeah, I think it'd be maybe interesting to like, how do you have the conversation with that person that's like, look, I'm getting mine, like I really don't care about the rest of you.
So success speaks volumes. What I would do in that case is I'd say, all right, I'm happy for you to continue, rocking and doing everything that you're doing because you're meeting your number, you're exceeding your number. What I'd like you to do, if you have any concept of being on a team, is when I bring you an issue as a sales leader that some of our folks are experiencing, just give me your insights. And most sales leaders are happy to do that. It's actually they're very experienced. They'll say, Bob, hey, listen, I know you got 18 calls booked today. You're taking that trip to Maui at the end of the week because you're that good. President's Club, all that fun stuff. When you were first coming up, how did you deal with the objection that sounded like this? And Bob knows 90% of the time, nobody's doing anything with this information. I've rarely ran into a salesperson that's employed by a company that isn't willing to give some bit of insider advice because they know it's probably not going to get used. Now, if it's a solopreneur, that's another situation because they don't have a reason to give you that information. But for a teammate, that's a good way to start. Now, as a sales leader, it's your job to scale that across your team. And so you don't need Bob to come in all the lessons learned meetings. You don't need Bob to debrief everything that you're doing like you would with your junior salespeople to spin them up drastically. But what you'll slowly start to see is those team members that you are sharing this with, that you are coaching, that are interested in getting better, they're going to start to catch up. At that point, and we've seen this happen on teams, the playing field starts to get leveled. Bob may still be outperforming everybody, but he's not outperforming them by multiples like he used to. Now Bob's going to get interested. All right, what is going on over there? Because these people are beginning to encroach on my success. And that's when we've seen salespeople begin to turn it around. But I want to make this very clear. Either way, as a sales leader, if you do what I just explained, you win. Because Bob is going to continue to do well if he's that good, if he can pivot and he can, stay ahead of the rate of change, which Bulletproof selling helps with. But at the very least, you're going to take your existing team, the members you are interested in developing and cultivating, and you're going to up-level each and every one of them by getting what works outside of the head of the successful folks and making sure that it's scaled across what you're doing.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, like I said earlier, like if you can build that dynamic, we've seen that result in just tremendous performance gains. And earlier you said something about how you would see enemy tactics kind of changing, and you would try to communicate those out. And it reminds me of this quote that I like about strategy, which is no battle plan survives contact with the enemy. I think there's some original, more elegant version of that, but that's the way that
that's pretty accurate. Yeah. And that was from a German field marshal back in like the 17th or 18th century. I mean, it's an old quote and it played back then too.
Yeah. And so so what you were saying before reminded me of that. And so I'm curious, like, so let's say somebody, adopts this point of view and they become more systematic about how they're selling. They start to share wins, and then something changes. So it's like, all right, well, now this is our approach. And like all of a sudden now, like it was working 3 months ago and now, or 6 months ago, now something's changed. Like, how do you, like, what are the signals that you would get that are sort of giving you an idea that now it's time to change and adapt? And how do you then drive that through, through a team to make sure your system doesn't get stale and isn't, you're sort of like not wed to something that maybe isn't working anymore?
So a lot of teams will wait for the market to change before they try to play catch up. And you will always be a step behind if that's the strategy that you're taking on this. What I've seen the very best teams do, and what we had to do in the military, was purposely change ourselves ahead of our environment. And so what that meant was we would be out on the battlefield and, we would have a fairly successful mission. Like everybody got to come home. We achieved our objective. That's a good day. But it didn't mean that it was like, all right, well, let's just keep doing more of that, which is exactly what most sales teams do. We would still take the time to sit down and say, all right, we got this thing done. We achieved our objective. Everybody, we brought them home. Everybody gets to see their family. But if we had to run it again, how would we make it better? And you're looking for incremental gains. Probably not going to come across that mind-shattering realization that we should have banked left instead of right, and that would have really, allowed us to get this done in a quarter of the time. Probably not going to come across that. But you will come across small things like, well, if we'd have stacked up outside that door and everybody knew where they were supposed to be, instead of us having to figure it out in the moment, we could have cleared that building, quarter faster or whatever that looked like, right? Small incremental wins. For a sales team, to take a look at your wins and say, well, we closed deals, we met our goals this quarter, or whatever that thing is for you. Like we completed that cycle, right? We pushed that sale through. This thing is done. It's in the can. To look at that and say, how do we make it better? And to do this as part of a regular practice. What that will allow you to do is not have to worry about playing catch up with the market. Because if you ask the question, how could we have made that sale even better? And you get great insight from your team, even if it's incremental change, and you implement it, you change the next sale by implementing what you learned from the last win, you stay ahead of the rate of change. The market will not change so fast that process will not keep you a step ahead. Even when COVID happened, we saw the companies that were engaged in this process, they already had the plans in place to go virtual. They already had the contingencies in place to shift their markets because they were looking at always staying a step ahead. They didn't wait for the environment to change before they, waved their hands in the air. I don't know what to do. They had a process in place. So I would recommend that first. But if you're in a situation now where you're just looking to stay ahead of, the rate of change out there, because if you don't change, you're going to miss your goal. The market changed. Now you are playing catch up. I would take a look at what are the things that would need to change as soon as possible for you to get back on track. So what are those large gaps in your sales process? What are the things that are causing you the most lost deals? Take a look at that, bridge those big gaps as much as you can first, so you can at least get a flow of traffic going across that bridge, even if it's a single lane. And then you can look at down the road, all right, we've at least got communication between one chasm and the other. We are pushing deals past that stage in the pipeline because we've solved that immediate problem that we realized. Get on track as soon as you can to looking at, all right, we got that deal in the can. If we had to do it again, what would we do differently? How would we serve the customer more? How would we engage them better? What marketing assets could we have sent that would have answered the questions that we had to deal with at the closing table that probably could have been solved earlier on? And that'll keep you ahead of the rate of change so you don't find yourself in that position again.
Yeah, it reminds me of another quote, which I'm probably going to misstate, and I don't remember who said it, but it was something along it might have been Eisenhower, something along the lines of, I found the plan to be relatively useless, but the planning to be indispensable, or something along those lines.
Yeah, I've also heard that luck is the residue of a good plan.
Yeah, right. And I imagine in speaking of sort of the preparation aspects of it, in your prior life, the stakes were quite high, and so like imagine that makes the preparation that much more important, and maybe you take it more serious. Like on a sales team, sometimes what you'll see is, and I especially see this right now where, you sometimes just lose a deal just from, I don't know, just from like you didn't follow up appropriately, or you didn't have the right questions asked. And like, how should teams think about preparing their reps, or if you're an individual rep, like how should you think about like how much time and effort should you spend on the preparation to really be as good as you can be, versus like making more phone calls, or whatever your kind of sales process looks like.
So if your ICP alignment is pretty on point, like you're dropping leads in the beginning stage of the pipeline and they're already a moderately qualified buyer, it gets a lot easier for you to prep. If you drop a lead in my lap, Joel, and you're like, hey, Joel, you say, hey, Shawn, there's a VP of a company. I'm not quite sure what they do. I'm not quite sure like how long the guy's been in that position. I'm not quite sure how many people they manage, but maybe a good fit for you. There's an enormous amount of prep I've got to do to be ready for that call, right? Because I don't have a lot of data. I don't have a lot of intel. But if I know I'm likely going to be talking to the same types of job titles, they're going to be managing the same companies in the similar industries, there's less prep. If that's the market that I'm in, and most salespeople are, right? We kind of know what our ideal buyer looks like, smells like, sounds like. When we get in front of that meeting, and maybe it's 15 minutes out from the meeting, that's when I'm conducting my prep. And I'm asking a couple of really basic questions of myself. The first one is, what are the objectives that I have for this meeting? And if your job is to drive meetings, so you're on the the inside sales side and you're just like banging the phone all day, not a lot of prep, right? You're just hoping for conversations, which we try not to rely on hope as a sales strategy. Tee those up a little better, but maybe you're 200 calls a day. I don't know if I'm getting any convos today. I just got to make cold calls. And I've been there. I know what that's like. If you're in the model where you've got calendared meetings, how do I prep for those? What are the objectives that this call needs to achieve? Not to make the sale necessarily, but for this to be moved further into the pipeline. So maybe I'm moving this from a market qualified lead to a sales qualified lead, or whatever your internal terminology is. I know that I have got a buyer name and a job title, but I need to find out these 5 other things to move this forward in the pipeline. If you can't make the sale today, and you'll be able to tell real quick whether that's going to happen or not, knock out as many of those other checklist items as you can to advance that in the pipeline. That's on the call, right? But if I'm prepping for my call, I need to own success here. And this is exactly what we did on the battlefield. if I can't accomplish my primary mission, what is the secondary objective that I have? It's to learn more about my high value target. We even had a tertiary objective, which was if I can't accomplish my mission and I can't learn more about this target, is this mission worth pursuing in the future? Is it too risky? Is the reward not worth the work that we're putting into it? For a salesperson, it's the same thing. If I can't make the sale and I learn nothing new about this prospect, which means they're probably a hammerhead. Like if you get in a conversation and you're learning nothing new, it's probably because they're giving you the cold shoulder. Make the call. Is this person going to be a decision maker today, tomorrow, or ever? And if the answer to all those questions is no, rip them from your pipeline with extreme prejudice, as they said in Apocalypse Now,
Yeah.
and move on to a different prospect. But that's one element of preparation. Another element of preparation that you could do is to look at what you know about this prospect. Do that quick LinkedIn search. And debriefing sales calls is we could do a whole nother episode on this one, but it's to take all of the things I've learned from my past calls where I've asked what if I'd have known about my high value target walking in here would have been really valuable. And maybe it's to figure out, we went to the same university. Well, how do I find that out about every future prospect? Or, our wives volunteer at the same social club, or our kids play, on the same sports league, or their company's going through a transition that I've guided dozens of clients through in the past. If you know that stepping into the conversation, you can be a lot more valuable a lot sooner. And that really comes from learning the hard way, but debriefing your calls. So looking at what are my objectives? What do I need to know about this prospect walking in here that could help me more quickly establish rapport? And the final one, asking yourself, what can I do to serve this prospect? Knowing what I know about them and knowing about my objectives, what's the one thing that I think will really be of service in this conversation, whether I make the sale or not? Because if we really want to establish ourselves as partners with our prospects and with our customers, they can tell real quick if we're just there to push a sale. But if we show up and we're interested in learning about them, we know their company is going through a transition, but how does that specifically look for them right now? What are the roadblocks that they're running into? How can I help clear the way for them? Show up with that information, and whether you make the sale or not, you're going to put that phone down knowing that you were of service to another human being, which is, I think, the ultimate goal of a good salesperson. Because, and this is, if we have time for a really, 15-second story real quick.
Yeah.
I was watching a bunch of people at a conference once. There was a Medal of Honor recipient being interviewed. And they asked this Medal of Honor recipient how many targets he'd taken out on that mission. This Medal of Honor recipient, right? He's probably a pretty good shot. But the recipient looked at the interviewer and he said, no, you're asking me the wrong question. Interviewer said, okay, what question should we be asking you? And this Medal of Honor recipient said, instead of asking me how many targets I had taken out, you should ask me how many folks we were able to bring home. And I heard that and I was like, well, that's got some application to sales. Because in sales, it's not about how many people we sell to. That doesn't dictate mission success. It's how many people we serve. You can make a lot of sales on low margin items to bad customers that take up every aspect of your time. You didn't serve them by selling to them. But we really know if we've hit a good customer, we serve them in our sale. They're appreciative of the service that we're providing, of the value that we bring to the table that's above and beyond the product or service that we deliver. That's a good day for me as a salesperson, because I know that's going to be a referral source that's going to make the rest of my job so much easier. Yeah,
good advice. Try to serve your customers. I think it's true in leadership. It's true in sales. And on behalf of the Hard Sell community, we thank you for your service and joining us here today. If folks want to learn more about Bulletproof Selling or get the book or be in touch, what are the best ways to do that?
So absolutely follow me on LinkedIn, Shawn Rhodes, Chief Sales Sergeant of Bulletproof Selling, and our website is bulletproofselling.us. No surprise that we grabbed the US domain. That's the team that I play for, and I love supporting American companies and helping them win on the battlefield of business.
Great. All right. Well, Shawn, thanks again for joining us here, and we'll hopefully talk to you soon.
Thanks.